Mr. Whitmore, I need you to understand something before you say yes. 4 families already brought them back. Ronald Whitmore stayed crouched on the worn tile of Havenwood's rec room, grease still under his fingernails from the boiler he'd come to fix, not the life he was about to choose. 3 years a widower. 1 paycheck from the city. A jacket that still smelled like the maintenance garage. Across from him, the caseworker held a folder with a red stamp on the corner. Behind her, 7-year-old Mitchell and Janice sat pressed together on a bench by the window. Every other kid in that room had swarmed him the second he pulled out a screwdriver. These 2 hadn't moved. Why these 2? The caseworker asked. I could show you children who'll run to you on the first visit. Ronald watched Janice rub the sleeve of her sweater between 2 fingers, over and over, like she was counting something only she could feel. He watched Mitchell watch his hands instead of his face. Because nobody's run to them yet, Ronald said. Somebody should stop waiting for that. He didn't know it yet, but 22 years from that bench, those same 2 children would put his name on a building and hand him the keys to his own life back. That morning, all Ronald knew was that 2 kids were sitting in front of him, waiting to find out if he'd walk away like everyone else. 3 years earlier, Ronald had buried his wife, Monica, after an aneurysm took her in a single afternoon. 9 years married. 6 of them spent trying for a child that never came. There had been the appointments, the treatments that didn't take, the nights they prayed without saying so out loud. The last thing she'd said about it, hand tight around his. If it doesn't come through me, maybe it comes another way. They started looking into adoption. Brochures in a kitchen drawer. A folder half filled out. Monica used to say children didn't need parents who had it all figured out, just parents who didn't disappear when it got hard. She never got to finish the sentence into an application. She was gone before the forms were signed. So Ronald did the only thing he knew how to do with grief. He fixed things. Boilers, pipes, wiring. Anything with a part he could name and a problem he could solve with his hands. Monday through Friday he kept Atlanta's municipal housing units running. Weekends he picked up car repairs for extra cash he didn't need to spend on anyone. His house went quiet in every way that mattered. No second plate at dinner, no reason to leave a light on. 4 miles from where he slept, 2 4-year-olds who'd already lost a mother of their own were learning, 1 return placement at a time, exactly what it felt like to be given back. It was a broken heating unit that put Ronald in that building in the first place. Havenwood's system had gone out on a Friday night in October, and nobody on the weekend rotation wanted the call. Ronald took it without being asked twice. An empty house on a Saturday wasn't worth protecting. He expected an hour of work and a quiet exit. Instead, the second he opened his toolbox in the rec room, half the building's kids found him. Can you fix anything? What's that tool for? Are you a mechanic? Ronald answered what he could, kept working, let them crowd around him the way kids do around anyone with a drill. But 2 children by the window never moved. A boy and a girl, matching enough to be twins, sitting close on an old wooden bench like the space between them was the only thing holding the room together. He noticed the boy first, watching his hands, not his face, tracking every screw he pulled and set down in the same order. Then he noticed the girl flinch, just slightly, every time the drill kicked on. Ronald didn't think about it. He just switched to a hand screwdriver for the rest of the job. It took longer. He didn't mind. Somewhere in that extra 20 minutes, the girl's shoulders came down from around her ears, and the boy's eyes moved for the first time from Ronald's hands to something closer to his face. When he finished, Ronald packed up slow and walked toward them instead of the door. He didn't reach for a handshake, didn't crouch fast or loud. He lowered himself down a few feet away and opened his palms, empty, the way you'd approach something you didn't want to spook. I'm Ronald. The girl looked toward the exit. The boy studied him a long moment before he spoke, quiet and flat. Are you leaving? Ronald almost answered on reflex. Eventually. He caught the look that crossed the boy's face the second the word left his mouth, something closing like a door easing shut, and understood, too late and then just in time, that the question wasn't really about that afternoon. But I'll come back, Ronald said. The boy looked at him then. Really looked. It only lasted a second, but Ronald had spent a career noticing which repairs held and which didn't. This one held. A caseworker leaned in the doorway watching. Their file's not an easy read, Mr. Whitmore, she said quietly. 4 placements. 4 returns. Last family said they'd never be normal. Ronald didn't look away from the twins. Nothing about normal was broken in this room today, he said. Just a heater. He left without asking their names. He came back the next Saturday anyway. The caseworker met him at the door, arms crossed, not quite hiding a smile. "Heater's fine, Mr. Whitmore. Nothing to fix today." Ronald glanced past her, toward the rec room, toward a window and a bench he already knew by heart. "I know," he said. "I'm not here for the heater." He came back the Saturday after that too. And the one after that. By the fourth week, the caseworker, Diane, he'd learned her name was Diane, stopped meeting him at the door with paperwork excuses. She just nodded him through, like a man who fixed a heater that didn't need fixing anymore had earned the walk down the hallway on his own. Ronald never rushed anything. He'd learned that much from 20 years of repair work. You didn't force a stuck valve, you worked it loose. So he didn't ask about custody. Didn't ask about forever. He just showed up, same time, same bench, same open hands. Slowly, in pieces, Diane told him the rest of what was in that folder. Mitchell and Janice had come into care at 4, after their mother Rachel died without warning, an infection nobody caught in time, and their father signed away what little claim he had rather than raise 2 kids alone. There'd been relatives. One aunt willing to take Janice, no more. An uncle who said he could manage Mitchell maybe if someone else took the girl. The state had refused. Whatever else was uncertain about these two, nobody in the system was willing to split them in half. So they went into foster care together. And 4 times together they came back out. The first family kept them 11 months before a series of meltdowns. Mitchell, mostly undone by a canceled trip, a moved bedtime, a new babysitter who didn't know the schedule, wore the household down past what it could hold. The second family had wanted Janice from the start and tolerated Mitchell for a while, until tolerated wasn't a strong enough word anymore. The twins overheard a conversation through a cracked door about which agency handled sibling separations. They didn't sleep for 3 nights after that. Whatever trust had been building came apart faster than it built. The third family tried harder than the first 2 in a way that did more damage. "Look at me when I'm talking to you. Give your new mama a hug. Say thank you the right way." Small corrections repeated daily meant well and landed wrong. Mitchell stopped talking almost entirely for 2 months. Janice stopped drawing. The fourth family lasted the longest, 8 months, and ended with a single sentence that outlived the placement by years. The foster father, standing in Diane's office, arms crossed, tired in the specific way of a man who'd decided he was right. "They're never going to be normal." Nobody wrote that verbatim in the file. They didn't have to. It became the file anyway, the shape everyone read into the twins before they'd even met them. Ronald asked Diane why she told him all of it all at once, like she expected it to change something. "Because I wanted to see if you'd still show up Saturday," she said. "You did." What Ronald noticed that nobody else seemed to have written down was what the twins were actually good at. Mitchell could watch a mechanism once and understand it. Not guess at it, understand it the way some kids understood a story after one reading. Ronald brought him a dead alarm clock one Saturday, the kind with real gears, and set it on the bench between them without a word. Mitchell had the back off in 4 minutes. He didn't ask permission. He didn't look up for approval. He just worked, and Ronald led him, and that was its own kind of conversation. Janice, it turned out, thought in rooms. She traced the shape of the rec room with her eyes, where the windows sat, where the shelves broke the wall, how the light moved across the floor by the hour, and something in her settled when the geometry made sense. Ronald brought her graph paper instead of coloring books. She filled 3 sheets before she said a single word to him about it, and what she drew wasn't a house from a storybook. It was Havenwood, redrawn, with the loud furnace room moved to the far end of the building and a quiet corner added by the window where she and Mitchell already liked to sit. Ronald never asked either of them the question every other adult in their life seemed desperate to ask. "Do you like me? Do you trust me? Are we bonding?" He asked one thing instead every Saturday on his way out the door. "Want me to come back next Saturday?" Mitchell eventually started answering. "Same time." "Yes." 10. It wasn't affection, not in any form Ronald could point to and name. But it was a promise kept out loud, 7 days running, and by December Mitchell had started saying it first. Ronald asked Diane for the adoption paperwork on a Tuesday, standing in her office still in his work jacket, having driven straight from a job. She looked at him like she was checking for a joke she hadn't caught yet. "You're serious?" "Yes." She didn't say no. She said everything else instead. The single-parent home study, the income requirements, the therapy cost that insurance wouldn't fully cover, no family nearby to help on the hard nights, and underneath all of it, unspoken but audible, for other families had already tried and failed. The evaluator assigned to his case put it more plainly weeks later, across a desk that smelled like old coffee. "Mr. Whitmore, I need you to hear this clearly. Love isn't always enough." Ronald didn't flinch. "No," he said. "But staying counts for something. For families prove that by not doing it." The evaluator wrote something down. Ronald didn't ask what. He submitted the application that Friday. 2 weeks of silence followed, the kind that made him check the mailbox before he'd even parked the truck. Then the letter came. Application denied. Reason: insufficient support structure and inadequate preparation for 2 high-needs children. Ronald stood in his kitchen and read it twice, like a third reading might change the second line. It didn't. He set the letter on the counter and, without deciding to, opened the drawer beside the stove, the one he hadn't opened since the funeral, where Monica's old adoption brochures still sat folded exactly where she'd left them. Underneath the pamphlets was a sheet of her handwriting, half a grocery list and half something else entirely. One line underlined twice. "Don't give up because you're scared." Ronald read it once. Then he picked up the phone. "This is Ronald Whitmore," he said when the office answered. "I'd like to appeal." The appeal gave Ronald 60 days to prove the letter wrong. He spent all 60 of them like a man working overtime on a job that mattered more than any boiler. 3 nights a week, after a full shift, he drove to a community center on the south side for parenting courses built for kids like Mitchell and Janice. He sat in folding chairs meant for people half his age and learned words he'd never needed before: sensory regulation, visual schedules, the difference between a shutdown and a tantrum, what an individualized education plan was supposed to protect and how often it didn't. He learned that predictability wasn't a nice-to-have for the twins. It was the floor everything else stood on. He came home each night and applied what he'd learned like a punch list. The kitchen light had buzzed for 6 years and Ronald had never once noticed. He replaced every bulb in the house with something softer, warmer, silent. He tore out the spare room's single bed and built 2 frames instead, pushed close enough that Mitchell and Janice could reach across the gap if a night went bad, because Diane had mentioned, almost in passing, that the twins had never once slept fully apart. He framed a quiet corner by the window for Janice, low light, no traffic path through it. He labeled a set of drawers for Mitchell: screws, gears, batteries, wire, because a boy who needed to know where everything belonged deserved a house that told him. He gave up the weekend car repairs first. The money had covered small extras: new boots, gas, the occasional dinner out, but weekends were about to fill up with therapy intake appointments and evaluations, and there was no version of both. His supervisor at the maintenance department found him restocking a supply truck one evening and asked, not unkindly, why a single man was gutting his savings and his schedule for 2 kids the county hadn't even given him yet. "You're changing your whole life for children who aren't even yours," his supervisor said. "That's exactly why I'm changing it now," Ronald answered. "Waiting until they're mine means they've already waited too long." The home study came on a Thursday afternoon in March. The social worker walked through Ronald's house with a clipboard and a face that gave nothing away, checked the outlet covers, opened the pantry, ran a hand along the new bed frames in the spare room like she was testing for splinters. Ronald had scrubbed every surface twice. He'd printed the visual schedules and laminated them, even though nobody had told him to laminate anything. She paused in the hallway, in front of a photograph Ronald hadn't thought to take down. Monica, 28, laughing at something out of frame. "Your wife?" the social worker said. Not a question. 3 years now, Ronald said. She turned to face him fully. "I have to ask this directly, Mr. Whitmore. Are you pursuing this adoption because you're lonely?" Ronald didn't answer right away. He'd expected questions about money, about scheduling, about backup childcare. He hadn't expected that one, and he respected her enough not to give it a fast answer. "No," he said finally. "I'm lonely because my wife died. Those children aren't medicine for that. I don't need them to fix anything in me. I just don't think 2 kids should keep losing families because the families needed something the kids couldn't give them." The social worker wrote for a while without looking up. When she finally closed the folder, something in her posture had changed. Not warmth exactly, but the particular quiet of someone recalculating an answer they thought they already knew. The appeal was approved 11 days later. Temporary placement first, a trial the file called it, though nobody said that word out loud in front of the twins. At Havenwood, Mitchell and Janice stood by the front doors with one small bag each, everything either of them owned, sorted into a single duffel apiece, a fact that told Ronald more about their last 4 years than any file had. Mitchell looked up at Diane, not Ronald. "How many days?" Diane blinked. "Sweetheart, I don't." "How many days until he sends us back?" Mitchell said flat, already braced for the number. Ronald heard it and didn't try to fix it with a big promise. He crouched instead, the way he had the first day, hands open. "I can't tell you there won't be hard days," he said. "I'd be lying and you two would know it." He waited until Mitchell's eyes found his. "But I can promise you this. Hard days won't make me disappear." Neither twin said anything back. But Janice's hand found the strap of her bag, and Mitchell's shoulders came down half an inch, and that was as close to yes as either of them had left to give that day. They walked out to Ronald's truck together. The first night broke every plan Ronald had made. Janice couldn't settle. The refrigerator's hum was wrong, some pitch or rhythm that didn't match whatever machine had hummed at Havenwood, and no amount of adjusting the thermostat fixed it. Mitchell's bed was 4 inches further from the wall than his old one had been, and 4 inches turned out to be enough to undo him completely. By 2:37 a.m. both children were awake, and Ronald, running on no sleep in a home study he still wasn't sure he'd passed, stood in the hallway wondering for one long second if the evaluator had been right after all. Love wasn't always enough. Maybe this was where that proved true. Then he thought of Monica's note, still sitting on the kitchen counter. "Don't give up because you're scared." He didn't have a speech for 2:37 in the morning, so he didn't try to build one. He sat down on the floor outside their door and stayed. At 3:10 the door cracked open. Janice looked out at him, still sitting there, still awake. "You're still here," she said, like she was checking the facts against what she'd learned to expect. "I said I would be," Ronald said. She didn't smile. She didn't say anything else. But she left the door open when she went back to bed, and Ronald stayed right where he was until morning. The mornings found their shape before anything else did. Ronald learned to lay breakfast out the same way every day. Same bowl, same spot on the table, same 3 options pictured on a laminated card taped to the fridge so nobody had to translate a spoken question into a decision before 7 a.m. Janice pointed at her choice. Mitchell read the card out loud, every morning, like confirming it hadn't changed overnight. School drop-off became its own small ritual. The noise-canceling headphones handed to Janice at the car door, not before because she'd taught Ronald without a single word that too early felt like a cage and too late felt like an ambush. Mitchell needed the opposite. Headphones on before they even left the driveway, so the world had already gone quiet by the time it got loud. Ronald learned their languages the slow way, one correction at a time. He learned that Mitchell's silence in the car wasn't sulking, it was processing, and that if he waited it out instead of filling it, Mitchell would eventually hand him a full sentence, sometimes a good one. He learned that Janice's silence was different. Hers didn't resolve into speech most days, and that was fine because she'd started leaving drawings on his nightstand instead, floor plans of rooms that didn't exist yet, which Ronald understood, eventually, as her version of a bedtime story. Somewhere in that first year, Mitchell started calling him Ronald outright, dropping Mr. Whitmore without ceremony, the way you'd drop a formality you'd outgrown. Janice still said almost nothing directly to him. Ronald never asked her to. He never once pushed either of them toward Dad. He'd learned enough by then to know that word, if it ever came, had to come on its own schedule, not his. The school conflict arrived in October, in the form of a letter requesting a meeting. Ronald showed up straight from a job, still in his city maintenance uniform, boots dusted with drywall. The special education coordinator glanced at the uniform, then at him in a way that told Ronald exactly what she'd already decided about how this meeting would go. "We're recommending a more restrictive placement for both children," she said, sliding a packet across the table. "Given the severity of their needs, a self-contained classroom would better serve." "Based on what evaluation?" Ronald asked. She paused. "Their diagnoses generally indicate." "Their diagnoses aren't an evaluation," Ronald said. "I've read the actual testing. Mitchell's in the 98th percentile for mathematical reasoning. Janice scored above grade level on every spatial assessment she's been given. Nothing in either file says restrictive. It says different." The administrator across the table shifted, the kind of movement people make when they're refiling someone in their head. Ronald didn't wait for her to finish doing it. "I'm not asking you to pretend my children don't need support," he said. I'm asking you to stop confusing support with limitation. There's a difference between building a ramp and locking the door. The meeting ran another 40 minutes. It ended with both twins staying in their existing classrooms, with accommodations written into the plan instead of a transfer written into their file. Ronald drove home still in his work boots, and didn't mention any of it to Mitchell or Janice that night. It wasn't theirs to carry. It was his to fix. The storm hit in late spring, the kind that rattled the windows before the rain even started. Janice was under the kitchen table before the first real crack of thunder finished. Ronald didn't reach for her, didn't ask her to come out. He lowered himself to the floor instead, back against the cabinet a few feet from the table's edge, close enough to be found and far enough not to crowd her. Then the power went. Mitchell's voice came sharp and fast from the hallway. It's 8:14. Bedtime is 8:30. The clock says nothing, it's wrong, it says nothing. Ronald was up and moving before Mitchell finished the sentence. He found the flashlight in the junk drawer by feel and walked Mitchell through the routine anyway, out loud, step by step, narrating what the dead digital clock couldn't. Teeth at 8:20. Pajamas at 8:25. Story at 8:28. Lights out at 8:30, near enough. Mitchell's breathing evened out somewhere around the pajama step, the way it always did once the shape of the night matched the shape in his head. By the time Ronald got back to the kitchen, the thunder had softened to something more distant. He sat back down against the cabinet, flashlight resting on the floor between them, and waited. Dad. The word landed so quietly Ronald almost missed it. He didn't move. What is it? He asked, keeping his voice level, like the word hadn't just rearranged something in his chest. Will the thunder stop? Yes. A pause longer than the first. Will you still be here when it does? That's the plan, Ronald said. Janice didn't come out from under the table. But she stayed close enough to the edge that Ronald could see the toe of her sock, and that was enough for both of them. For a while after that, things held. Then Ronald came home from a double shift one evening to find an envelope taped to the front door, his name typed across the front in a font that wasn't trying to be gentle about it. Property sold. New ownership. Rent effective in 30 days. Increase of 38%. He read it twice on the porch, doing the math without wanting to. 38% wasn't a number he could absorb into overtime. It wasn't a number he could tape and fix his way around. Through the front window, he could see Mitchell and Janice at the kitchen table, plates in front of them, waiting for him the way they always did before starting dinner without him. Ronald folded the notice twice and slid it into his jacket pocket before he opened the door. Who wants pancakes? He called out like it was any other night. Two heads turned toward him. Mitchell smiled the small, careful smile he'd learned to give. Janice reached for the syrup without being asked. Ronald smiled back and didn't let either of them see what he already knew, that this house, this schedule, this hard-won quiet, was 30 days from a rent he had no way to pay. Ronald decided, somewhere around the second week, that the twins didn't need to know. He picked up every overtime shift the city would give him. When those ran out, he started fixing neighbors' cars after dark, working by a shop light clamped to a fence, quiet enough not to wake anyone 2 streets over. Weekends he took whatever emergency call came in. A burst pipe on a Sunday, a dead furnace on a holiday, jobs other men turned down because they had families waiting on them. Ronald had a family waiting on him too. That was the whole reason he said yes. He stopped buying lunch. Told himself he wasn't hungry most days, which was true often enough to make the lie easy. His work boots split along the left sole in November, and rather than spend money he needed for the light bill, he wrapped the seam in duct tape and kept walking. He believed, the way tired people believe things, that none of it showed. Mitchell noticed the boots first, noticed everything mechanical, noticed the tape, noticed that it had been reapplied twice. He didn't say anything about it. He just filed it the way he filed every detail, waiting for it to make sense. Janice noticed the mail. She couldn't read every word on the envelope stacking up by the toaster, but she recognized the shape of the one stamped in red, and she recognized that Ronald opened those particular envelopes alone in the kitchen, after he thought they were asleep. Ronald thought he was protecting them by carrying it quietly. He wasn't. He was just making sure they carried it alone too. The overheard argument happened on a Tuesday, through a door Ronald had forgotten wasn't fully closed. The property manager's voice came through clipped and final. Something about the 30-day notice, about the new owner's numbers, about how sympathy didn't change a spreadsheet. Ronald's voice stayed level in a way that meant he was working hard to keep it there. Mitchell and Janice sat frozen on the stairs, listening in the specific way children listen when they suspect the conversation is about them without being sure how. Later that night at the kitchen table, Mitchell finally said what he'd been turning over. "If we were one person," he said, "rent would cost less." Janice's face changed instantly, not tears yet, just a kind of stillness that meant they were close. Ronald set down what he was holding and knelt in front of both of them at their level the way he always did when something mattered. "Listen to me carefully," he said. "Children do not owe their parents rent for being alive. Not you. Not anybody's kids anywhere." Mitchell studied him. "Then why are you tired?" "Because grown-ups get tired," Ronald said. "That's just what the job is." Janice shook her head slowly. "That's not the whole answer." Ronald opened his mouth. Nothing came. She was right, and they both knew it, and for the first time since he'd brought them home, Ronald didn't have a fix ready to hand them. Janice found him 3 nights later, asleep at the kitchen table, forehead nearly resting on a stack of unpaid bills, one rough hand still curled loose beside them. She didn't wake him. She got the blanket off the couch instead and laid it over his shoulders, careful the way she handled things she didn't want to break. Mitchell came in behind her and looked down at their father's boots, still taped, still on his feet because he'd fallen asleep before he'd made it to bed. "He's tired because of us," Mitchell said quietly. Janice looked at the boots too. Then at the blanket she'd just placed. Then at the man underneath both. "He's tired because he stayed," she said. "If you believe every child deserves someone who won't give up on them, like, subscribe and keep watching." Neither of them said anything else for a while. Then Janice went to the junk drawer and came back with a blue notebook and used its cover still stiff. She set it on the table between them. Mitchell picked up the pencil first. He wrote in careful block letters, "Dad fixes things." Janice took the pencil next. Underneath his line, she added her own. "One day we fix something for Dad." They closed the notebook and put it away without discussing it further, the way you'd put away something too important to leave lying out. The new rent came due at the end of the month and Ronald couldn't meet it. Cheaper housing turned out to be its own kind of maze. 3 landlords in a row who softened the second Ronald mentioned 2 children with accommodation needs. One asked, without much interest in dressing it up, "Are they disruptive?" Ronald picked up his paperwork and left before he said something he'd regret. He wasn't going to let a stranger's question turn into an insult his children never heard but somehow always seemed to know about anyway. It was Marcus Bell, a co-worker from the maintenance crew, who finally solved it. Mentioned an old landlord he knew, a man named Abrams, retired, patient, who owned a small duplex on the other side of town and didn't much care about paperwork so long as the rent showed up and the place got taken care of. The duplex needed work. Ronald didn't mind. Work was the one language he'd always spoken fluently. He spent 2 weekends rewiring outlets and patching drywall, and for the first time, it wasn't a solo job. Mitchell sorted every screw and bracket into labeled containers without being asked, narrating sizes out loud like an inventory clerk. Janice walked the empty rooms with her graph paper, redrawing the layout twice until she found an arrangement that put both bedrooms on the quiet side of the building, away from the street. It was the first house the 3 of them built instead of just moved into. That night, in the new duplex, boxes still stacked against most of the walls, Ronald finally slept. Really slept, the kind he hadn't managed in weeks. Janice didn't. She sat up in the half-dark with the blue notebook, passed the 2 lines already written, and started to draw. Not a bedroom this time. Not a floor plan of anything they'd ever lived in. A large building, wide, with too many windows to be a house. Mitchell came and sat beside her, watching the pencil move. "What is it?" he asked. Janice kept drawing. "A place where families like us don't have to keep moving." Mitchell looked at the sketch a long moment. The windows, the doors, something in the shape of it that made sense to him the way mechanisms always did. Then he took the pencil from her and wrote, beneath the drawing, in the same careful letters as before, Project 1. By 10, Mitchell had taken apart more machines than most adults touch in a lifetime, and Janice had filled the better part of a shelf with graph paper nobody had asked her to save. Ronald kept saving it anyway. The communication device incident happened when Mitchell was 12. A classmate's speech tablet had stopped working mid-lesson, a cheap model borrowed from the school's limited supply, the only one that fit the boy's needs. Mitchell had it open on his desk before the teacher noticed, wires and casings spread out in the exact order he'd need to put them back. "Mitchell Whitmore, that is not your property," the teacher said, sharp enough to draw the whole room's attention. It's broken, Mitchell said, not looking up. I'm not breaking it further. He was right. 20 minutes later, the tablet worked. Better, actually, with a battery connection resoldered cleaner than the factory had left it. The teacher's reprimand turned into something closer to silence. Ronald heard about it that evening from a proud phone call, not a disciplinary one. The following month, he took Mitchell to an engineering fair downtown, half reward and half research. Mitchell walked the aisles of assistive technology booths with the focus of someone reading, not browsing, communication devices, sensory tools, mobility aids, each with a price tag that made Ronald's stomach tighten out of old habit. Mitchell stopped in front of one particular device, a communication tablet nearly identical to the one he'd fixed with parts from a junk drawer, priced at just under $4,000. Why is help expensive? He asked, not really to Ronald, more to the booth itself. Ronald didn't have an answer. Mitchell didn't seem to expect one. He just kept staring at the number, filing it the way he filed everything, waiting for it to eventually make sense. Janice's moment came at 14, in a project nobody had assigned her to take quite that seriously. Her school's library entrance was routinely the loudest, most disorienting 5 minutes of most students' day. Fluorescent lights, a narrow doorway, competing signage, no way to slow down before stepping into the noise. For a design class project, Janice redrew the whole entrance from scratch. Softer lighting staged in stages instead of all at once. Clear wayfinding that didn't rely on reading dense text under pressure. A small quiet room tucked just off the main path, and visual clutter stripped back to almost nothing. The architect brought in to judge the class project studied Janice's plans for a long time before he said anything. Who helped you with this? He finally asked. This level of detail. Someone trained you. My house did, Janice said. He didn't fully understand the answer, and Janice didn't explain further. She meant Ronald. The softer bulbs, the quiet corner by the window, years of a father who'd rebuilt a home around what she needed instead of asking her to survive a home that wasn't built for her. She'd learned, without ever being taught the word for it, that environments could bend. People didn't always have to. Word started to travel. A boy who fixed things cheaper than professionals, a girl who redesigned spaces adults had stopped questioning. Gifted became a word people used around the twins, sometimes to their faces, usually with a kind of relief in it, like talent was the thing that finally made their differences acceptable. Ronald caught the pattern early and pushed back against it at the dinner table more than once. You don't owe the world greatness because of what you survived, he told them one night, when a teacher's praise had come wrapped a little too tightly around the word inspiring. You don't owe anybody a comeback story. And if we're just ordinary? Mitchell asked, testing the idea. Then you're ordinary and happy, and that's good too, Ronald said. That's plenty. It was a small distinction, but Ronald meant it to matter, and it did. He was one of the only adults in either twin's life who'd valued them before anyone knew what they could build. The blue notebook, meanwhile, had stopped being one notebook. By the time Mitchell was 13, there were 3. By 14, 6, stacked in a shoebox under Janice's bed, spines worn from handling, never once opened by anyone but the twins themselves. Ronald noticed. He always noticed. He just never asked. Marcus caught him watching the twins carry the shoebox between rooms one evening and asked the obvious question over coffee the next morning at the shop. You're not even a little curious what's in those? Of course I'm curious, Ronald said. Then why not just look? Ronald thought about it longer than the question probably deserved. Because trust isn't something you demand from children, he said finally. It's something you give them first. Whatever's in those notebooks, they'll show me when it's theirs to show. Marcus didn't argue with that. Not many people did once Ronald said something in that tone. The scholarship letters arrived within a week of each other, the spring the twins turned 18. Mitchell's came from Georgia Tech, full admission into biomedical engineering, a program built for exactly the kind of mind that had once taken apart a broken alarm clock on a rec room bench. Janice's came from a design program with a scholarship attached for architecture and inclusive design. The kind of opportunity that didn't get offered to many 18-year-olds without a portfolio behind them already. Ronald read both letters twice each, standing in the hallway, and then went and sat alone for a while in what had once been Monica's room, her photograph still on the shelf where it had always been. They made it, Mon, he said quietly to a room that didn't answer back. He believed it completely. He didn't know and had no way of knowing that the twins didn't feel the same way about it, that somewhere in their minds making it wasn't a scholarship letter. It was a promise, still unfinished, written years earlier in careful block handwriting. That night, in the room they still shared more nights than not, Mitchell opened the newest notebook and wrote, beneath a dozen filled pages neither of them had shown anyone, "Phase 2 begins." Janice read it over his shoulder. Then added her own line underneath, in handwriting that had gotten steadier over the years but hadn't lost its weight. Dad cannot know. The first semester the calls came almost every night. Mitchell described his engineering labs in more detail than Ronald could always follow, but he listened to all of it anyway. The circuitry, the professors, a project involving low-cost sensors that lit up whenever Mitchell talked about it. Janice didn't call as often, but she sent sketches instead, photographed and texted late at night, campus buildings redrawn the way she redrew everything, looking for what could be better. Ronald mailed care packages every few weeks without being asked. The specific granola bars Janice liked, a set of replacement wire strippers for Mitchell, socks, because some habits from raising them never fully switched off. He kept doing it long after either twin needed a father to remember what they liked to eat. Then, slowly, the way tides go out without announcing it, things changed. The calls got shorter. Texts started standing in for conversations. A holiday came and went with a rushed video call instead of a flight home. Ronald told himself and told Marcus and told the twins themselves that he understood. They're building their lives, he said more than once. That's what this is supposed to look like. Privately, in the quiet of a house that had gotten used to 2 extra voices in it, it hurt more than he let anyone see. What Ronald didn't know, what neither twin was ready to explain yet, was where all that missing time was actually going. Mitchell sat across from a row of investors in a downtown conference room, a slide deck open behind him showing assistive devices priced at a fraction of what he'd seen at that engineering fair years earlier. Janice, 3 states away some weeks and back in Atlanta on others, spent long afternoons buried in land use documents and zoning maps, looking for a property that could hold what they were actually trying to build. They found it eventually, an abandoned facility near the edge of Ronald's old maintenance district, the kind of building most investors walked straight past. The twins walked through it slowly instead, flashlights out, checking load-bearing walls and window placement with the same quiet focus they'd once brought to a rec room bench. The bank turned them down the first time. Too young. No completed projects of this scale. An unclear return on investment for a facility serving a population most spreadsheets didn't know how to value. One investor was blunter than the rest, in a meeting that nearly ended the whole plan before it started. Facilities for disabled families aren't profitable enough, he told them, not unkindly, just flatly, the way people say things they've already decided are simple facts. Janice didn't blink. Then you're not our investor. Mitchell closed his laptop, unhurried. We'll find another equation. They left the meeting together and kept going. Christmas came and Ronald drove to the airport expecting Janice's flight, the way he had every year she'd been away. He stood near the arrivals gate, watching strangers fold into hugs with people who'd clearly missed them, holding a homemade sign out of habit more than necessity, since Janice always knew exactly what he looked like. His phone rang before her flight number appeared on the board. "Dad, I'm so sorry," Janice said, voice tight in a way Ronald couldn't quite place. "Something happened with the project. I can't make the flight." Ronald watched another family collapse into an embrace a few feet away, a mother lifting a small girl off the ground. "It's okay, baby," he said and meant it mostly. He drove home alone through empty holiday streets and somewhere around a red light he said the rest of it out loud to no one. "They're supposed to leave, Ronald. That's what children do." He believed that. He'd believed it his whole life, ever since the courses and the home study and every night since. But belief didn't fully quiet the older, smaller fear underneath it. The one that had been there since Monica died, since the twins' first Saturday, since every family before him had walked away from those 2 kids for reasons that always sounded reasonable at the time. Maybe he'd spent his whole life building 2 children strong enough that they no longer needed him at all. He didn't say that fear out loud to anyone. He just carried it the way he carried everything. Ronald turned 59 that spring, though nobody at work made much of it. His knees had started complaining on cold mornings the way old hinges do, and his hands, steady for 30 years of fine repair work, had begun stiffening by the end of long shifts. Management called him in that same season, an outsourcing decision working its way through the department, an early retirement package offered as a soft landing before the harder version arrived. Ronald turned it down flat. A pension check wasn't the same as a paycheck, and he still had bills that didn't care how his knees felt. He didn't tell Mitchell or Janice. They had enough of their own weight to carry wherever they actually were these days. It wasn't theirs to fix. Marcus mentioned it to Mitchell anyway in an offhand phone call that wasn't meant to be a leak. Just two people who cared about the same man comparing notes. Mitchell didn't say much on the call. He didn't have to. The moment it landed, something in the timeline they'd been quietly building for years shifted forward, hard. Janice called Mitchell late that same night, past midnight, her voice low and fast. "We're out of time," she said. "How much do we have?" Mitchell asked. "Everything. All of it." "Then use it." Pause. "The reserve too?" Mitchell was quiet for a moment, longer than usual, the kind of silence that meant he was doing the math one more time even though he already knew the answer. "He used everything on us," he said finally. "Every dollar, every weekend, every year he had. There's no reserve that matters more than that." Janice closed her eyes on the other end of the line. "Do it," she said. The line went quiet. Somewhere behind that quiet, a plan that had started with 2 children and a blue notebook finally started moving faster than either of them had let their father see. The text came from Janice on a Tuesday, out of nowhere, after weeks of near silence. "That Saturday, 10 a.m. where your old work clothes. Trust US." Ronald read it 4 times. He'd learned, over 22 years, that neither twin wasted words, so he didn't ask questions back. He just let himself hope, quietly, that whatever they'd been building all this time was finally ready to be shown to him. Saturday morning, a black SUV pulled up outside his house at 9:58, 2 minutes early. Ronald almost sent it away. A car like that, idling in front of a duplex, felt like money someone shouldn't have spent on him. The driver rolled down the window before Ronald could say any of that. "Mr. Whitmore," the man said, like they'd met before, though Ronald was certain they hadn't. "They're expecting you." Ronald got in. They drove through Atlanta longer than he expected, past streets he recognized in pieces. A maintenance depot he'd worked out of decades earlier, a stretch of road near Havenwood that had been rebuilt twice since he'd last driven it. Ronald watched the city go by and said almost nothing, the old instinct to brace for whatever came next running quiet under everything else. The SUV finally slowed outside a property Ronald didn't recognize at all, new, large, still catching morning light off glass that hadn't had time to collect dust yet. There were people everywhere. Families standing in loose clusters. A cordon of photographers with cameras already up. City officials in suits that didn't belong on a Saturday. Former staff from Havenwood, some of whom Ronald hadn't seen in 20 years, and beside them, leaning slightly on a cane now, unmistakably still herself, Diane Mercer, the caseworker who'd once told him gently that love wasn't always enough. Marcus stood near the front, grinning in a way that told Ronald his old friend had known about this for longer than he'd let on. Ronald stepped out of the SUV, still not fully understanding what he was looking at. Mitchell and Janice came through the crowd together. 29 now, both of them, and Ronald took in the sight of them the way you take in something familiar wearing new shape. Mitchell still had the same watchful stillness Ronald remembered from the rec room bench, still counted things with his eyes before he spoke, still carried a precision in how he moved his hands. But there was confidence layered over it now, the kind that comes from having built something real. Janice wore clothes chosen for comfort over show, soft fabric, no scratch of formality anywhere on her, and she walked toward Ronald with the same steady deliberateness she'd always had, not fixed, not different in the way the world had once demanded, just fully, unmistakably herself 22 years further along. Mitchell reached him first and took his right hand. Janice took his left. "What did you two do?" Ronald asked, voice already unsteady. "We finished the notebook," Janice said. Behind them, a curtain the size of the entire building's facade dropped away, and Ronald stopped breathing for a second that felt much longer than a second. The Whitmore Center for Inclusive Living. They walked him through it slowly, the twins on either side of him, narrating each section like a life laid out in rooms. There were sensory-friendly family apartments, built so no child would ever be turned away from a home because of what they needed to feel safe in it. An affordable therapy wing, priced so a single father with one income wouldn't have to choose between rent and a session. A parent respite program, a place for exhausted single parents to hand the weight down for an afternoon, something Ronald had never once had and had never let himself miss out loud. There was an employment and skills center built for neurodivergent young adults, teaching trades the way Ronald had once taught 2 children to trust him, Slow, predictable, patient. There was a design lab with Janice's name over the door, and an engineering lab with Mitchell's beside it, both already staffed, both already running. But it was the building's name over the entrance that Ronald kept returning to. Not Mitchell's name. Not Janice's. Just Whitmore. The family name, the one he'd given them and the one they'd apparently decided to give back. Diane Mercer found him near the courtyard, leaning lightly on her cane, eyes wet before she even spoke. 22 years ago, she said, I asked you if you really knew what you were taking on. Ronald let out a wet laugh. I didn't. Neither did they, Diane said, nodding toward the building rising behind him. None of us did. Ronald didn't have anything to say back to that. He just stood there a moment, letting it hold. Mitchell stepped forward and handed him something small and worn at the edges. A blue notebook, its cover soft from handling, exactly as Ronald remembered it from a shoebox he'd never once opened. His hands shook slightly as he turned to the first page. The handwriting was younger there, careful, block letters pressed hard into the paper. Dad fixes things. Underneath, a second hand just as careful. One day we fix something for Dad. Ronald kept turning pages. Drawings of an apartment layout he didn't recognize yet but somehow already understood. Columns of numbers, expense calculations and a child's early attempt at math that grew steadier with every page. Scholarship research printed out and taped in. Early sketches of assistive devices, crude at first, refined later into something close to what he'd seen in the engineering lab minutes earlier. A whole section devoted to college strategy, which programs, which scholarships, which cities. Property listings, circled and crossed out and circled again, tracking a search Ronald had never known was happening. Near the back, in handwriting that had matured into something closer to how the twins wrote now, one line stood alone on its own page. We are not leaving Dad. We are learning how to come back big enough to help him. Ronald's knees nearly went. He didn't try to stop the tears this time, didn't have it in him and didn't want to. Janice stepped closer, put a hand gently on his arm. Dad, she said. There's one more thing. Mitchell led Ronald back outside before he'd fully caught his breath, one hand still resting on his father's shoulder like he needed the contact as much as Ronald did. Across the street sat a building Ronald knew better than his own hands. The Municipal Maintenance Depot, 30 years of his life poured into its trucks and supply rooms and early mornings. Ronald assumed, walking toward it, that this was simply the next stop on the tour. Maybe a partnership. Maybe the company had donated equipment to the center, and the twins wanted him to see it. Janice stepped in front of him instead and took his rough hand in both of hers. She pressed something small and cold into his palm and folded his fingers over it. Ronald looked down. A set of keys. What are these? He asked. Yours, Mitchell said. Ronald looked from the keys to the building to his children's faces, searching for the part of this that would make sense the way everything else that day eventually had. It didn't take long for them to explain. The depot's owners had been quietly preparing to sell for over a year, outsourcing pressure from above, the same pressure that had once tried to push Ronald into early retirement. Mitchell and Janice had spent months arranging what the bank once told them wasn't profitable enough to bother with, controlling ownership of the company, reorganized from the ground up. A share of its profits would flow straight into the Whitmore Center. And the depot itself would become something it had never been under any previous owner. A place running paid apprenticeship programs for neurodivergent adults, for single parents trying to raise kids on one income, for young people aging out of foster care with nowhere steady to land, for anyone willing to learn a trade without a college degree behind their name. Ronald stared at the keys in his hand like they might rearrange themselves into something he could refuse more easily. No, he said. Absolutely not. I didn't raise you two for this. We know, Mitchell said quietly. I didn't adopt you so you'd owe me anything. That was never, Ronald's voice caught. That's not what any of this was supposed to be. Janice stepped closer, close enough that Ronald could see she wasn't going to back down from this the way she never had, even at 7 years old on a wooden bench. We know, she said again. Then why? Ronald's voice broke fully on the question. Mitchell struggled for a moment, the old careful precision in his face fighting against something rawer underneath it. When he finally spoke, it came out steady anyway. Because you were the first person who stayed when staying cost you something, he said. Everybody before you left when it got expensive. You stayed when it cost you sleep, money, your knees, your whole life. Nobody made you keep doing that. You just did. Janice took Ronald's rough, scarred hand in hers, the same hand that had once opened palm up on a rec room floor and asked for nothing in return. "Everybody before you asked what was wrong with us," she said. "You asked what we needed." Ronald broke completely then. No attempt to hold it, no reflex to stay composed in front of the camera, still trailing at a respectful distance. And for the first time in either of their lives, Mitchell and Janice closed the distance together, both arms around him at once, not because any occasion called for it, not performing comfort for anyone watching, because they wanted to. Ronald held on and, without fully deciding to say it, whispered against the top of Janice's head, "Monica would have loved you too." Janice went still against him. "We know about her," she said. Ronald pulled back slightly, searching her face. "How?" Mitchell answered before Janice could. "We found her adoption notes years ago. Some of your old boxes when we were helping you move." He hesitated, choosing the next part carefully. "There was a line she wrote. We didn't take it. We just kept it. It's on a wall inside the center now, near the family apartments." He didn't have to say which line. Ronald already knew, the words settling over him the way they had the night he'd found them in a kitchen drawer, desperate and out of options. Children don't need perfect parents. They need parents who don't disappear when things get difficult. It wasn't a replacement for anything Ronald had done. It was underneath it, the reason he'd known at 39, exhausted and grieving, exactly what kind of father to try to be. Monica had given him the sentence. He'd spent 22 years proving it. Several years later, Ronald still came to the center most weekday mornings, technically semi-retired, technically not required to be there at all. He carried a small toolbox anyway because there was always something worth fixing, and he'd never once believed retirement meant he had to stop. He was crossing the main lobby one Tuesday when he noticed a man he didn't recognize sitting across from two foster children on a bench near the intake office. The man looked overwhelmed in a way Ronald recognized instantly, hands not quite sure what to do with themselves, eyes darting toward a caseworker's folder like it might explain something the children weren't saying out loud. One of the kids had both hands pressed over her ears. The other watched the man's hands instead of his face. Ronald stopped walking. It looked almost exactly like a Saturday morning 22 years gone. The man noticed him standing there and, maybe recognizing something steady in an old man with a toolbox, asked the question that had been sitting on him since he walked in. "Sir, how do you know if you're ready for something like this?" Ronald glanced through the glass wall behind the man, out into the courtyard, where Mitchell and Janice, 30-something now, fully themselves, fully grown, stood arguing cheerfully over a set of blueprints for the center's next building. "You don't," Ronald said. The man's face fell slightly, like he'd been hoping for a different answer. "You just decide whether you're willing to keep showing up while you learn," Ronald said. "That's the whole thing. That's all it ever was." The little boy on the bench looked up at Ronald then, curious despite himself. "Do you work here?" Ronald looked down at his old work jacket, worn soft at the elbows, and then up at the name stretched in clean letters across the lobby wall behind him. "Whitmore Center for Inclusive Living." He smiled. "Something like that," he said. 22 years earlier, 4 families had looked at Mitchell and Janice and decided they were too difficult to love. Ronald Whitmore never believed love would erase what made them different. He simply believed different wasn't a reason to leave. He couldn't stop every meltdown, couldn't undo every cruel word from a teacher or a stranger, couldn't always make the rent, couldn't make the world understand his children the way he'd learned to. But he could do one thing over and over for 22 years without fail. He could stay. And the 2 children everyone once called impossible grew into adults who took engineering, architecture, and the memory of one exhausted father's sacrifices, and built a place that made staying possible for thousands of families who might otherwise have run out of people willing to try. Ronald had spent his whole life repairing things that belonged to other people. In the end, Mitchell and Janice hadn't just handed him a company. They'd continued the only lesson he'd ever really taught them. Find what's broken. Understand what it needs. And don't walk away. If Ronald's story touched you, comment, "I'll stay," subscribe, and share this with someone who needs this message.